Thousands of years ago, on the banks of the Nile, where great temples rose and golden palaces shone, there lived a queen. Her name was Arsinoe II. She was a woman whose beauty fascinated, whose intelligence defeated her enemies, yet who was lost in the darkness of her own bloodline. This tragic story, which left its mark on Egyptian history, shows how power can corrupt the human soul and how ambition can destroy even the closest family ties. Arsinoe II was not only a queen, she was also a victim, a player in a dangerous game, and a master of survival. Today we will uncover the hidden truth of her life. We will see how a young girl forced into incest by her own father rose to become a queen, how she became part of political schemes, and how she eventually left her name in history. Let us now step into one of the most glorious yet darkest times of ancient Egypt. When Alexander the Great, one of the most powerful rulers of the ancient world, died in 323 BCE, he left behind a vast empire. But the empire could not last. His sudden death led to fierce struggles among his generals. These men, known as the Diadochi, divided the empire between themselves. Egypt fell into the hands of one of Alexander's most loyal commanders, Ptolemy. But Ptolemy was Greek, not Egyptian. Yet, through military skill and political strategy, he became ruler of Egypt. Still, power could not rest only on the army. He had to appear legitimate in the eyes of the Egyptian people. For them, the pharaoh was divine, and divine blood was preserved through marriages within the family, between brothers and sisters, fathers and daughters. This was seen as a sacred tradition. The Ptolemaic dynasty adopted this custom. For them, incest was not corruption, but a political tool. It was a way of telling the Egyptian people, we too belong to the sacred bloodline of the pharaohs. This belief shaped the dynasty's destiny and prepared the ground for one of history's darkest stories. On the surface, the Ptolemies seemed to bring Egypt into a golden age. Huge temples rose by the Nile, palaces glittered, theaters flourished, and the famous Library of Alexandria became a center of learning for the entire Mediterranean. But behind this brilliance lay a darker reality: secrets, betrayals, conspiracies, and marriages within the family. For the Ptolemies, blood was everything, not love, not family, but blood as a tool to protect power. When a girl was born, her fate was already decided. She might one day marry her father, her brother, or her uncle. She was born not as a daughter, but as a piece in a political game. This was the world Arsinoe II was born into. She came into life in 316 BCE, when her father, Ptolemy I, had already secured Egypt's power and its influence across the Mediterranean. She was born in luxury, in a palace full of wealth and splendor. Yet even there, in those shining halls, shadows of intrigue and dark secrets surrounded her. From her earliest years, Arsinoe could not live as an ordinary child. Her playground was not the gardens, but the world of politics. From birth, her future was planned: who she would marry, what alliance she would secure, and how her life would be used for the dynasty. Her fate was dark from the beginning. For the Ptolemies, family ties were no longer bonds of love, but chains of power. A girl could be forced into the arms of her own father or brother in the name of sacred tradition. To the Egyptian people it looked divine, but in truth it was the destruction of a child's life. Arsinoe's birth was just another link in this cruel chain. Her path looked golden, yet it was covered in betrayal and sorrow. Her future promised beauty, intelligence, and power, but also pain, tragedy, and the shadow of incest. And so began the story of one of history's most tragic queens. The palace where Arsinoe was born appeared magnificent from the outside. The waters of the Nile lapped against its walls, and golden columns glittered in the sunlight. Servants, musicians, dancers, and scholars, all were busy celebrating the power and splendor of the Ptolemaic dynasty. But behind those walls, a little girl was growing up, and for her, this grandeur was only an illusion. In reality, From the moment she was born, Arsinoe was burdened with a weight no child could bear. Her father, Ptolemy I, was a conqueror, a king, and a ruthless strategist. He saw his daughter not as a child, but as a valuable piece in the Game of Thrones. As a result, Arsinoe's childhood was not filled with warmth and love like that of an ordinary girl. The first thing she learned in the palace was not innocence, but the language of power. At a very young age, Arsinoe was taught multiple languages. Greek, because her family was of Greek origin; Egyptian, because it was necessary to assert authority over the people; and alongside these, history, mythology, and governance. Her education was far from that of an ordinary child. She was not being taught how to be a wife, but how to become a queen. Yet what wounded Arsinoe's spirit the most was that she had no control over her own future. There were always whispers in the palace. When she grows up, she will marry her brother, or perhaps lie in her father's bed. Such words might have seemed ordinary at the time, but they planted deep fear in her young heart. She was just a child, meant to play, sing, and dream, but she was already confronted with the dark face of her destiny. Even when playing in the palace gardens, she never felt free. Every move was watched, every word noted, every action evaluated for her future role. In her father's eyes, she was not merely a child, she was a pawn to protect the throne. During her childhood, Arsinoe silently witnessed the struggle for power within the palace. There were constant tensions among her siblings: who was favored, who had claims to the throne, who would be exiled. These pressures shaped the young girl's mind. She learned not to trust. In the palace, friendships were temporary, sibling bonds were false, and love was always conditional. Sometimes, alone in her room at night, Arsinoe would look beyond the Nile and ask herself, "Who am I?" Was she a princess, or merely a tool in her father's hands? She was young, but she understood one thing: her destiny would never be hers to control. The events she witnessed as a child also left deep marks on her psyche. One sibling sent into exile, another falling victim to palace intrigue. Each event taught her the same lesson: no one is safe in this palace, and worst of all, even blood ties could not be trusted. In this family, a brother could kill a brother, a father could claim his daughter, and a mother could scheme to place her son on the throne. Thus Arsinoe's childhood passed, outwardly magnificent, full of jewels and wealth, but in reality filled with fear, uncertainty, and profound loneliness. At a very young age, she had already learned not to trust anyone. This lack of trust would deeply shape her adult life, as she would always live alert, always feeling watched. Her childhood laid the foundation for her own tragedy. The lessons she learned would one day make her a powerful queen, but they would also leave her deeply wounded and filled with inner pain. For Arsinoe, childhood was not a time of innocence. It was the beginning of her tragedy. As Arsinoe moved from childhood into her teenage years, the weight of the palace pressed down on her even more. Even before she turned 10, she knew that everyone around her saw her as a political tool. In her father's eyes, she did not see love, only expectation. On the faces of the servants, she did not see mercy, only the seriousness of orders. The splendor and grandeur of the palace could not hide the pressure bearing down on her. During these years, Arsinoe was not only growing physically, but also had to develop her intelligence and strategic abilities. Her education was no longer limited to childish lessons. She was now taught statecraft, diplomacy, history, law, and strategy. As a young princess, she began learning the skills to protect the throne and survive in political games. But the hardest lesson of all was learning to live under her father's shadow. Ptolemy I saw his daughter both as a child and as a political instrument, controlling every step she took. As Arsinoe entered adolescence, the whispers circulating through the palace corridors grew darker. Words like, "When she grows up, she will marry her father," left a deep fear in her heart. Her beauty and intelligence now attracted everyone's attention. The palace staff, advisors, and even her father's close circle had begun to notice her potential. This attention was both an advantage and a danger. It was an advantage because her talents could be used to strengthen the dynasty. It was a danger because being noticed also made her a target of jealousy, intrigue, and political manipulation. Relationships in the palace became increasingly complex. Secret rivalries among siblings, plots among servants and advisors sharpened Arsinoe's perception. At a young age, she had learned not to trust. Understanding who was friend and who was enemy became a matter of survival. Her inner world also took shape during these years. On one hand, she was fascinated by the palace's splendor and beauty. On the other, daily betrayals and dangers forced her to mature emotionally. For her, adolescence was not only a physical change, it was a psychological battlefield. In her father's eyes, Arsinoe increasingly became a political figure. This further limited her freedom. Her own desires, wishes, and childhood dreams were almost entirely ignored. Everything about her life had become a tool for the palace and the future of the dynasty, yet this pressure did not make Arsinoe a passive victim. On the contrary, it sharpened her intelligence and strategic skills. She was no longer just a child. She began to understand the palace's dark games, anticipate danger, and learn ways to survive. But this education also isolated her emotionally. She had to keep her heart closed, trust no one, and always remain on guard. Throughout her teenage years, Arsinoe grew under her father's shadow, but that shadow became the very element that shaped her future strength and intelligence. These years, forged in fear, pressure, and betrayal, would allow her to survive and later hold power as queen. At the same time, they left the first clear signs of her tragic destiny. The price of becoming a queen was a youth filled with loneliness and treachery. Thus, Arsinoe's passage from childhood into adolescence was not just a physical growth. It was the birth of a character shaped by the ruthless rules of the palace and her father's shadow. Her intelligence and strategic ability would ensure her survival in the deadly games to come. But the wounds on her spirit would never fully heal. For Arsinoe, stepping into adolescence, the palace was no longer just a place of learning. It had become a center of danger, hidden desires, and forbidden passions. Whispers echoed through the grand corridors, and servants and advisors moved like silent observers behind the scenes. Yet the darkest secret was that her own father had begun slowly testing her boundaries. At that time, incest was not a taboo for the Ptolemaic dynasty. It was an accepted tool for preserving the throne and maintaining power. Arsinoe's father was preparing to draw his daughter into his life, both to secure his authority and to keep the dynasty's bloodline pure. For Arsinoe, this created an indescribable fear and inner turmoil. On one hand, she knew she was valued in her father's eyes. On the other, she felt the trauma of being seen merely as an instrument. Every day in the palace was both a physical and psychological trial. Servants and advisors constantly watched her, observed her actions, and reported back to her father, who sometimes she was summoned to his chambers, other times she was briefed on the palace's political matters in secret corridors. But the most painful part was the personal danger underlying this education and supervision. Her father's desires and intrigues. Her adolescence had now transformed from a period of play and learning into a survival struggle. Hidden whispers in the palace rooms, shadows moving through corridors at night, and the dark desires lurking behind power struggles left deep marks on her soul. She was no longer simply a child or young girl. She had become both a target and a strategic player. During these years, Arsinoe began observing the other women and men in the palace with great care. She had to determine who was loyal and who was treacherous. By analyzing the actions of servants, advisors, and even her siblings, She learned to protect herself from potential traps. This skill would later make her a powerful queen and allow her to anticipate dangers within the palace. Yet her father's shadow was always over her. Love and affection were nearly absent, replaced by expectation, control, and pressure. Arsinoe's adolescence was shaped under this weight. Her own desires and emotions were constantly suppressed, while the needs of the palace and dynasty were prioritized. Though this stifled her emotional growth, it honed her intelligence and strategic thinking. Her inner world grew stronger yet fractured during these years. She learned to protect her boundaries, to keep emotional distance, but she also carried the marks of fear, loneliness, and betrayal. This young girl, raised in her father's shadow, would one day hold the power of the throne, and yet this trauma would forge her into a complex figure remembered in history. At this critical point, the darkest period of Arsinoe's life was beginning. Every step in the palace, every whisper, every observation strengthened her on one hand, while wounding her soul deeply on the other. These forbidden relationships and palace intrigues marked the most pivotal period of her destiny. Arsinoe was learning not only how to be a queen, but also how to survive. This process would ultimately shape her future. The palace, with its grandeur and its darkness combined, would both empower her and wound her deeply, turning her story into a tragic tale of strength, survival, and inevitable suffering. As Arsinoe transitioned from adolescence into maturity, her life became entirely a political arena. Every step she took in the palace affected not only her own future, but the balance of the entire dynasty. For the Ptolemaic family, marriages were never simply emotional bonds. They were among the most important tools of politics. Decisions about who would marry whom, which alliances would be formed, and which throne candidates would be supported were meticulously planned. At a young age, Arsinoe had already become a part of this complex game. Her beauty and intelligence drew the attention of many figures in the palace. Yet this attention was motivated more by self-interest and threat than by sincerity. She had to learn quickly who was friend and who was enemy, because every step she took was carefully watched and every word she spoke recorded. From an early age, Arsinoe learned that trust was a precious commodity. To trust blindly was dangerous. To watch everyone with suspicion was a necessity for survival. Political marriages in the Ptolemaic dynasty were both a threat and an opportunity for Arsinoe. Her father and his advisors planned to use her as a strategic tool. She would one day be married to her brother, her father, or another member of the dynasty. These unions were crucial for securing the throne and keeping rivals at bay. Every marriage decision affected not only two individuals, but the future of the entire kingdom. The betrayals Arsinoe witnessed during her youth also shaped her character. Rivalries among siblings, secret schemes by servants and advisors, her father's political maneuvers, all these forced her to become both cautious and strategic. She was no longer merely a child. She had become an observer who understood the palace's dark games and could protect herself when necessary. Yet these years also deepened Arsinoe's inner loneliness. Political marriages and dynastic intrigues harmed her emotional world. Not being able to choose whom to love, having to suppress her own desires, left deep scars on her soul. No matter how great the palace's splendor and display, her inner life grew darker with each passing day. The betrayals in Arsinoe's life were not only political, they were emotionally devastating as well. Her father's pressure and the conspiracies surrounding her eroded her sense of trust. Yet all this pain and betrayal shaped her into a strong and strategic leader. She had to sharpen both her intelligence and instincts to survive. During this time, Arsinoe came to realize that the palace's political marriages and intrigues were like a battlefield. Every action, every word, every relationship had consequences for the throne and the dynasty's future. She could not be a passive figure in these games. She had to act carefully to protect herself and strengthen her power. It was at this point that Arsinoe's character began to mature. She had learned to use both her intelligence and her strength. She discovered how to survive in the palace and understood the game of political marriages and betrayals. Yet this education left deep marks on her soul. She had to be strong, but that strength always came with pain and loneliness. This period was critical in shaping the queen she would become. The palace's complex intrigues, forbidden relationships, and political marriages honed her mind and strategic skills. At the same time, it laid the foundation for the tragic aspects of her life and the emotional wounds she would carry forever. By the time Arsinoe approached the end of her youth, she had physically matured and had become both an observer and an active player within the palace. Every strategy she had learned, every secret observation, and every survival tactic from her childhood and adolescence now came into play. She was no longer merely an ornament or a tool of her father. With her intelligence and skill, she had become a political force in her own right. The game of power in the palace was far more complex than it appeared. To be heir to the throne or to hold influence within the dynasty required more than bloodline alone. Arsinoe understood this and focused on developing her abilities. She began to master strategic thinking, diplomacy, understanding human psychology, and anticipating her rivals' moves. Her father's shadow still loomed over her, but she had learned to contend with it. She could anticipate his decisions, foresee the maneuvers of palace advisors, and protect herself from potential dangers. In the palace, power was not won by the throne alone. It was gained through knowledge and manipulation, and Arsinoe had grasped this completely. Yet the cost of power was steep. Arsinoe still could not fully trust anyone. Friendships were fleeting, family ties were fragile, and love was often a tool for manipulation. Enemies within the palace could strike silently through a hidden corridor, a whisper, or a trusted advisor. Without her intelligence and strategic acumen, survival in these games would have been impossible. The games of power extended beyond the palace walls into diplomacy and foreign relations. Arsinoe stood alongside her father in matters of politics, gaining knowledge of alliances and marriages with other dynasties. Her mind, sharpened even at a young age, rivaled that of a king. Yet this knowledge increased her responsibility rather than her freedom, for now every move she made affected not only her own fate, but the future of the dynasty and of Egypt itself. Arsinoe's power struggle was also an internal one. Growing up under her father's shadow, witnessing incest and palace intrigues, she had to suppress her own desires and emotions. Yet this inner strength transformed her from a passive victim into a strategic player. In the palace, every glance, word, and action was a tool, her only way to survive and maintain her power. During this period, Arsinoe learned to read the psychology of those around her. She could identify friends and foes, anticipate threats, and navigate the palace's treacherous environment. These abilities made her a central figure not only in the palace, but in the dynasty itself. She was no longer a girl living in her father's shadow. She had become a force shaping the palace through her intelligence and strategy. Yet every gain in power left a void within her. The price of being a strong queen was loneliness, lack of trust, and constant vigilance. Arsinoe understood this, but there was no alternative. To survive in the palace and remain a central figure on the throne, she had to use every strategy at her disposal. It was at this point that Arsinoe's character reached full maturity, strong, intelligent, strategic, and capable of survival, but also a woman shaped by deep wounds and a traumatic past. Every victory she achieved in the palace strengthened her, but it also deepened her emotional isolation. Thus, Arsinoe's mastery of power propelled her onto the stage of history, while her internal conflicts and the palace intrigues laid the foundation of her tragic destiny. She had become both a queen and a strategist, constantly fighting to protect her own life. As Arsinoe's life unfolded amid the palace's power games and political intrigues, deep wounds formed within her inner world. The pressures she faced at a young age, the threats of incest, constant surveillance, and relentless control weighed heavily on her, leaving both psychological and emotional scars. No matter how grand and magnificent the palace appeared, Arsinoe's inner life grew darker with each passing day. Her relationship with her father lay at the heart of her tragedy. The pressure and control exerted by Ptolemy reinforced the fear Arsinoe had carried since childhood. For her, the palace was not merely a place of learning or a center of power. It was a chain of traps that demanded constant vigilance. Living under her father's shadow left her nearly bereft of freedom and trust. Everyone in the palace recognized her potential and beauty. Yet this attention only made her life more difficult. Servants, advisors, and family members constantly discussed her future, planning which marriages and alliances would be most advantageous. Arsinoe had to suppress her own desires and feelings. She was no longer just an individual. She had become a symbol representing the political interests of the dynasty. The threat of incest left deep psychological scars. Experiencing this pressure as a child made her emotional development more difficult and instilled a lifelong sense of fear and vigilance. Arsinoe could find no safe space, neither within the palace nor within her own mind. Every glance, word, and action demanded careful calculation to protect herself from potential danger. The betrayals and intrigues she witnessed further deepened her tragedy. Rivalries among siblings, secret plots by palace advisors, and her father's political maneuvering all contributed to her emotional weariness at a young age. She was no longer just an observer. She had become a figure constantly fighting to survive and protect herself. Arsinoe's tragedy was intertwined with her rise to power. To survive in the palace and increase her influence, she had to develop strategies. Yet each step toward power deepened her emotional wounds. Every strategic move strengthened her while simultaneously isolating her emotionally. She had learned to be a powerful queen, but that power came at the cost of a permanent inner void and pain. The authority and respect she gained in the palace created a delicate balance. They both sustained her and inflicted suffering. Arsinoe had become a leader capable of shaping her own life, yet one forever alert and shaped by past traumas. This tragedy molded her character. It made her a strong and determined queen, yet left her with profound loneliness and difficulty trusting others. In conclusion, the tragedy in Arsinoe's life was not limited to incest or palace intrigues. It was the result of a series of events that profoundly affected her personal freedom, emotional world, and mental well-being. This tragedy allowed her to gain power while simultaneously confronting an inner void. What history remembers is both her strategic brilliance and her deeply tragic life story. Arsinoe's life left an important legacy not only for her own time, but also for generations that followed. Her existence shaped the balance of power within the dynasty and added a new dimension to royal traditions in Egypt. Drawing on the strategy and diplomatic skills she had learned in the palace, Arsinoe used them to her advantage in later years, securing a prominent place for herself in history. One of her most significant contributions was her role in maintaining the political stability of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Managing the internal balance of power through incestuous and political marriages became more effective thanks to Arsinoe's intelligence and strategic thinking. These methods set an example for future queens and rulers. Her legacy was not only about physical or political power, but also about strategic intelligence and the ability to survive. Arsinoe's personal tragedies and experiences within the palace enhanced her historical significance. The pain she endured and the betrayals she faced also made her a strong and cautious leader. Her life, shaped by palace intrigues and forbidden relationships, had a critical impact both on the continuity of the dynasty and on Egypt's position in foreign affairs. Moreover, Arsinoe made important contributions to Egyptian culture and royal traditions. During her time, palace discipline, education, and administrative systems became more institutionalized. She was not just a figurehead, but also a symbol of the dynasty's reputation and strength. Her intelligence and strategic skill ensured that she would be remembered as a powerful female leader in history. Nevertheless, Arsinoe's life was not always filled with grandeur. Inner loneliness, emotional pressures, and personal traumas marked the darkest aspects of her existence. Historians evaluating her life have noted not only her political achievements, but also the tragedies she endured. This duality makes Arsinoe both a strong and complex human character. Her legacy continued to be remembered by subsequent generations. Her strategic moves, survival skills within the palace, and methods of protecting the dynasty played a critical role in sustaining the Ptolemaic line. In the history of Egypt, she holds a place not only as a queen, but also as an unforgettable figure for her intelligence, strategic prowess, and tragic life story. In conclusion, the life of Arsinoe II was built on a balance between power and tragedy. The political and strategic skills she acquired in the palace made her one of the most memorable figures in history. At the same time, a childhood and youth filled with incest and court intrigues left permanent marks on her inner world. Arsinoe's legacy endures as a story of a life shaped by both strength and tragedy, securing her a lasting place on the stage of history.